Um, Thank you for meeting with us today. We are at Brooklyn Jesuit Prep in East Flatbush in Brooklyn. We're a middle school, a Jesuit middle school, and the sixth grade is my class, and we've been learning about the Holocaust through the novel Number the Stars. That's what's connected to our reading curriculum. But these students have shown that they're very mature and able to learn about a lot of what surrounded that time period, and knowing that you're a primary source and knowing about not wanting to repeat history, and learning from our past and always remembering we're here to listen very attentively to your story.
Sara, what age are these students?
They're sixth grade, so they're about 12 years old.
12.
11, 12 years old, yes.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So as I mentioned, my name is Joana Arruda. I work at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, which is located in Battery Park City in Lower Manhattan. I imagine you probably would be in person at the museum if it were a different time, but I'm glad that we're all meeting here today. So we will be hearing testimony from Paulette Singer Barrett, who's with us today. As your teacher mentioned, Paulette is a primary source because she directly experienced the Holocaust as a child. And so, this is a very different opportunity than, just reading about it in a book. So Paulette will share her very personal story with you all today. And I invite you all to, think of questions. You can either, at the end, type your questions into the chat box, and I'd be happy to read it for you, or you can unmute yourself at the end and ask Paulette directly. So without further ado, I will introduce Paulette to start. Paulette, let me share your PowerPoint with you, and whenever you're ready, feel free to get started.
Okay, thank you, Joana. I appreciate that. Since I am doing this from home, I don't guarantee that there will not be a pussycat crossing the screen in front of me. They're very curious to know what I'm up to, and this is a first experience for them addressing a Zoom group, but they're probably bored because they've heard me do this before. In any case, hello, and I'm very, very glad that you're interested in the stories that I have to tell. I'm going to have a wonderful partner in Joana, who's moving my slides for me. This is a three-way deal here. I'm home and my slides are at the museum where Joana is, and you guys are all in school. So we're going to try to make this work, and you'll have a chance to ask me questions later. So do make a note of things you'd like to ask me later. Okay, can we go to the first slide, Joana? There we go. Now, why do we need two slides of France? On the left, you see what happened to France when it capitulated to Germany. Germany said, we're going to occupy the northern part, and the French people who are collaborating with us can occupy the free zone. It isn't really free. We're going to be controlling it, but we won't be occupying it. That was very theoretical because, in fact, the Germans were all over the country. They were in the so-called free zone. They were in the occupied zone. They were everywhere. There were Germans in the entire country. And this happened after 1939, when World War II started. It had started because Germany invaded Poland, which was right next door to France. I show you the photo of France on the right side because it shows you very clearly the cities that were most important to me. In the north, the red circle is around Paris, where I was born, the capital of France. And further down, you see the circle that shows the cities, the cities that mattered a lot to me because my parents and I left Paris when I was a very small child, and we ran away because the Germans were doing terrible things to Jews up north. And so we ran down to where we thought it was safer. Clermont-Ferrand and Le Puy are the places where we spent most of our time until after the war. So that's where my life was in France. Okay, next slide, please. Now, this is a photo of my dear parents. My parents came from Poland. What were they doing in Paris? Well, my father represented the family business, and my mother came to study medicine. Beautiful people, aren't they? There was a group of pretty well-to-do Polish people in Paris. They were active socially. They became friends. They met each other. They went to the opera, and that's how my parents met. They fell in love. They moved in together, and this photo was taken early in their romance. Beautiful people. I love this photo. I have it. My father represented the family business, which was sending eggs from Polish farmers. Can we have the next photo, please? From Polish farmers. There we go. To hotels and restaurants and fancy food stores in European capitals. What you see here on the left is the family business, Singer, which is my maiden name. And you see my father standing on the steps there wearing a hat. And on the right, you see what the workers did. Something that my father taught me how to do. You could do it yourselves if you want to try it. And that is candling eggs. The word means holding an egg up to a light so that you can see what's going on inside the egg, and you can tell if the egg is fresh or if it has been fertilized and it's not good to eat anymore. Eggs, after all, are meant to be fertilized and turned into chickens. So these workers would look at every egg that was brought in by Polish farmers to decide whether they could then be packaged and sent off to fancy restaurants and food stores in Western Europe. If they were good, they'd be sent off, and the family made a lot of business that way. Remember, before you snicker at a funny business like that, we're talking about almost 100 years ago, when business was very different from what it is now. Try candling an egg. Hold it up to the light, see if you can see through it. You can see the yolk, and you can see all the parts of an egg. In any case, that was my father's business. Next slide, please. My mother was determined not to lead the life of a wealthy young Polish woman. She wanted to be a doctor. She persisted, and she went off to Europe. She went off to Paris, and she entered medical school. There she is in the first row. Thank you. Bottom left. She's the only woman you'll notice. Any other women you see were nurses. It was very unusual for a woman to be in medical school. Neither the colleagues who sat around with her nor the medical school faculty liked the idea very much of a woman being medical school. They thought she was a waste of a seat that should go to a male medical student. But she persisted, and she sat through the entire curriculum of 6 years, would you believe? And she graduated. She got a medical degree. And there she is, looking stubborn and self-satisfied. And she got her medical degree. Next slide, please. Now begins the saga of what happened to us. The war started. My parents had married. I had been born a few months after their marriage. And terrible things started happening to the Jews that the Germans rounded up. My parents fled first to the first town south of Paris, where they thought they'd be safe. They lived in a single room in a large apartment made up of individual rooms occupied by refugee families who each lived in a room. My parents and I lived in such a room. And the grandson of the man who owned that apartment fell in love with the way my mother and I looked. And he said to my father, I will get my grandfather to lower the rent if you get your wife and young child to sit for me so I can paint them. Well, we didn't much like the idea, my mother and I, but my father liked the idea of reducing the rent. So lo and behold, my mother and I sat for the young painter for a few days, and out came these paintings. we don't look very happy, my mother and I, and that's because we weren't very happy. I didn't like to sit still. I was 3 years old at the time, and my mother was very unhappy with the war and the whole situation, but she sat, and the rent was indeed lowered. While we were in this particular city, which is called Clermont-Ferrand, and again, remember, I was, as I told you, I was a little girl. One afternoon, my father had taken me out to play in a nearby square. My mother was doing some laundry in our single room when I saw Germans for the first time. I had no idea what Germans were. I was playing in this beautiful town square when all of a sudden I heard a rumbling noise, and it was coming from the four corners of the square. Beautiful, beautiful white stone square, and all of a sudden there were troops, soldiers in black uniforms, marching, making a lot of noise with their boots. I would learn later that German soldiers had been outfitted with boots that had very noisy taps on them, especially to make noise when they invaded a city in order to scare the residents. And behind them were these incredibly huge, scary tanks with guns, with huge turrets and horribly scary guns in back of them. And they marched from the four corners toward the center of the square. And this was the way that they would invade and occupy cities in France and warn the residents that they better obey, they better not stand in the way of the invading German forces. Well, we weren't about to stand in opposition to this horrible force. My father put me on his shoulders and we ran home. We packed, and during the night, my mother woke me up and said, "Darling, get rest. We're leaving. We're going to catch a train." Indeed, we went to the railroad station, and with suitcases and trunks and all kinds of belongings, we went on the train and we went to the next town we would occupy called Le Puy. Can we get the slide, please? This is a tourist photo of Le Puy, which is where we lived for all the years of the remaining time of the war until we came to America. This is a tourist photo. It represents, it shows what the tourist view of Le Puy is, standing atop a rock. In the distant future, in the distance, is a statue of the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child. The reason it's red is it was made from cannonballs that Napoleon captured at battles he won and melted down, and the statue was created from those cannonballs. Now, there is no elevator in that rock. There are only steps winding around the surface of the rock, and it took years to make that statue, with workers and donkeys working their way around on the steep rock, the steep steps, working around the rock to make that statue. Likewise, a little bit further down than in front, there is a monastery tower that was made in a similar way. The rocks to construct the monastery were carried around on steps outside the rock, and it took years to construct it. The town of Le Puy is a pilgrimage town. Catholics come to visit, and you see in the distance a beautiful cathedral. It's very well known, and it's a destination for pilgrims. And the Archbishop who lives there, in fact, was the Archbishop in whose private chapel my parents and I were baptized. Why were we baptized? Well, my father apparently made contact in the city we were in before, in Clermont-Ferrand. He made contact with people who were working hard to try and save the lives of Jews. And he sent us to this town and made contacts for us, who insisted that we needed to be baptized in order to protect our identities and to be able to hide the fact that we were Jews. So we were baptized in order to gain a Catholic identity. Now, I remember I didn't understand much of this. I was very little at the time, and my parents didn't tell me very much because they wanted to keep it all a secret. But I do remember the baptismal ceremony. And I remember being in this incredibly beautiful room, which was a chapel in the Archbishop's private quarters. And I think I even remember what I wore. Can you believe that? I mean, this is a ceremony that took place 75 years ago. In any case, we were baptized, and that gave us papers certifying that we were Catholic. And they were dated several years before the ceremony actually took place, so that it wouldn't be ascribed to our trying to save our necks as Jews, but rather to our having wanted to be Catholics. It became part of the papers that we carried with us to prove that we were good French Catholics. Can we get the next slide, please? Now, I show you this, and it seems like a departure from the story I'm telling, but this is Lafayette, and he's part of my story, as well as part of the history of America, for that matter. Lafayette, you may know, as a French hero who came to the States to help fight the war, getting America to break away from England, presented himself to George Washington and said, "I'm here to help you fight the British." But he was also very famous to us in Le Brie because he was a local hero. I'll tell you a little story as an aside to the story of the war, World War II. He was a local hero because he was born in a small town near Le Brie. The street that you can almost see is where my parents and I lived. And on a pedestal at the end of the street, there was this statue of General Lafayette. He was our local hero. There came a point during World War II when the Germans announced to the French that they were taking all of the French statues, the famous heroes of France, and taking them back to Germany to melt them down, to turn them into ammunition. They were going to turn them into guns and trucks and all kinds of stuff that Germany needed to wage its war. Well, the people of Le Brie weren't about to let their General Lafayette succumb to that kind of humiliation. So as soon as that announcement came, they brought down their Lafayette and he disappeared. It turned out, we found out many years later after the war was over, that the heroes of Le Brie had taken him down and taken him out to the farm country and had dug a huge, huge grave, you can call it, a big hole in the farm of one of their countrymen, and had laid Lafayette into this hole and covered him over and protected the space with vegetables and all kinds of growth so that you couldn't tell that he was there. And he stayed there for the duration of the war. As soon as Le Brie was liberated and the war was over, they dug up Lafayette. They brought him back during the night and put him up on his pedestal. And when the townspeople of Le Brie saw that Lafayette was back on his pedestal, they knew it was a sign that Le Brie was liberated and the war was over. And we knew then that we were okay. Lafayette was back. It was a very important signal to all of us. So that's a little side story. but he's one of my favorite heroes of French history. In any case, can we get the next slide, please? Besides Lafayette, L'Abri is also very well known for something else, and that is for its handmade lace. These ladies who make handmade lace were and still are on the streets of the inner city, the heart of the city today. You can see what they do. Handmade laces of L'Abri were then and still are today sent to the heart of Paris. In the old days, they were sent to the queens of France, who used them for to make lace dresses and to make the gowns for the weddings of the queens and to make lace curtains for the palaces. The handmade lace, as you can see, if you look closely, made by moving bobbins across pillows. The women barely look at what they're doing. They do it so mechanically. But when they're finished moving those bobbins, out comes a beautiful, beautiful lace that no two pieces are the same, because the women all change the patterns and create unique designs. And this handmade lace business goes back centuries, because the queens, going back to Marie Antoinette, used to call on the artisans of L'Abri to make laces for them for their weddings and for their children's baptismal gowns and for lace cloths and curtains for the palaces. And this is still something that is practiced today. If you go to the heart of L'Abri, you will see these women sitting on chairs outside their houses on the cobblestone streets of the inner city, making handmade laces. It's a beautiful sight. Next, please. Now, getting more personal. This is where my parents and I lived. My father had probably made a connection in Clermont-Ferrand, and when we arrived in L'Abri, we were directed to the man who owned this property that included this house, and he provided for us to occupy this house and be safe there, even though we were Jews, which he knew. This house, which we lived in for the entire time until after the war, when we came to America. This house had no heat. We lived in the upstairs rooms, 2 rooms, behind the 2 windows you see. The downstairs, behind that door that you can see, was totally cold and uninhabitable. Behind the 2 windows on the left side was a room with a pot-bellied stove and a sink, a small sink. And the room on the right was a single bedroom in which my parents and I slept. Initially, I had I guess you could call it a crib, but eventually I had a bed, and my parents had a big double bed, and we all slept there. There was no heat. The only source of heat was the pot-bellied stove on the left, where my mother cooked, and where, when it was cold, we used to put bricks in the oven part of the stove and then place them in the beds to get the beds warm. There was, as I said, a sink there, and we used it to wash ourselves. We used it to provide water. There were some cabinets, and my mother used to preserve fruits and vegetables in wine bottles, of all things. There was no refrigerator. Any food that was left from a meal was put in a food box that hung outside the window overnight and during the day to be preserved. And we tried very hard not to have any food preserved because it didn't last very long. Um, you may notice I haven't mentioned any bathroom. That's because there wasn't any. Can I have the next slide, please? This was the bathroom. I don't know if anybody can recognize it, but on the left you will see an outhouse. I don't know if anyone is familiar with an outhouse. On the right you will see what was basically a goldfish pond. And the way this all worked is you were supposed to, if you intended to use the outhouse, you were supposed to take um, a bucket and fill it with water from the goldfish pond and take it in with you to the outhouse and flush it down the hole after you were finished using the outhouse. I was always afraid that somebody would allow a goldfish to slip in with the water from the goldfish pond and would send a poor goldfish to his death. And that frightened me terribly. So I used to sometimes keep watch over the goldfish pond and warn people to be very, very careful. But there weren't very many people who lived in that area. So there wasn't that much work to be done. My parents and I kept a metal can that was about 1.5 feet high with a cover on it. And we kept that on the landing of our house between that cold first floor and the second floor, 2 rooms. And we used that during the day. And then in the evening, my father would take the can down to the outhouse and empty it and flush it out and then bring it back so that we could use it the next day. That was our bathroom for all the time that we lived in Le Puy. And I remember that when my parents and I arrived in New York, and I'll come back to that later, we lived with cousins for a very short time, cousins who had a large apartment in Manhattan. And my favorite room in that apartment, as you might guess, was the bathroom, which was a huge West Side apartment bathroom. And I used to love to be in that bathroom. I used to take a book in that bathroom and sit there and just sit on the edge of the bathtub and read my book and just enjoy being there, just enjoy being in the large room that was a bathroom. My history gave me the memory of the old days with the can on the ledge. Can we get the next slide, please? These people were critical to our being saved in Le Puy. A few days after we arrived, my mother took me by the hand to visit the police headquarters. My mother and I ran all the errands. My father didn't go out. It was too dangerous. The police were always stopping and arresting men and sending them off to concentration camps if they decided that they were Jews and it wasn't too hard to tell. They were taking hostages on the street. They were sending people off to concentration camps all the time, and it was dangerous for my father. So my mother and I ran all the errands, and she always took me with her whenever she went anywhere. The man on the left was the man at the police headquarters who was in charge of the Jewish lists. And we had to go to him, my mother and I, to register as Jews who had arrived in Le Puy. His name was Captain Fachot. And so my mother and I went to him and presented ourselves at his desk. And my mother handed him our papers, such as they were, and explained that we were there to register. And he looked at the papers and looked at my mother and said, but Madame, you are not Jews. Why don't you go home? And he proceeded to give her some identity papers that were false identity papers. And he gave her food coupons so that she could go to the market and buy some food for the day. It was confusing, and initially my mother rejected his attempt to turn her away. And the conversation went back and forth in a very confusing way until finally it got her to understand that he knew who we were. And she realized that before leaving Clermont-Ferrand, my father must have connected with some members of the underground who had connected with members of the underground in Le Puy and sent word ahead that we were coming, so that there were connections being made that facilitated our arrival in Le Puy. Getting saved was no easy matter. You didn't just waltz in from one town to another and discover that there were people willing to help you. There were connections. There were people who called people who arranged these things, so that by the time we arrived in Le Puy, connections had already been made, and we were extremely fortunate in that regard. There were people who had arranged for us to get the baptismal arrangements made. There was this police captain who knew we were coming and already had false papers ready for us. It was absolutely astonishing. We would not have been alive in Le Puy had these arrangements not been made. In any case, the woman on the right was the police captain's wife, who was also extremely important to the war effort. She was in charge of the post office. And because she had been born in Metz, a French city up close to the German border, she was completely fluent in German. And because of that, she was very useful to the Germans, who trusted her to handle their messages coming in by train and coming in by postal service regarding the movement of German soldiers and German armaments. She got all those messages and she transmitted them to the Germans. What they didn't realize was that she was also transmitting them to the to the French resistance, so that the French kept track of all the movement of German armaments and German troops. She provided an enormously important service to the French resistance all through the war. After the war, both of them were awarded medals by the French government. They had been incredibly useful to the war effort and received awards from the French president. What they also did was to become very close friends of my parents. And those relationships lasted for years and years, to the point where I became friends with their children as adults. And some of those relationships are still alive today. And I'm in touch with their grown children. And I have visited France, and I have visited their children, and I have stayed in touch with them. The relationships were absolutely critical to the survival of my family. Now, many other things were critical to our survival. My mother, who, as I mentioned, graduated medical school and was an incredibly talented physician, was also very talented in many other vital things. She baked. She knew how to make soap. She knew how to make clothing. She had a sewing machine that she rented by the month, on which she made all the clothing she could for the family. That included making things for my father on the sewing machine, things for me, things for herself. I mean, she made clothing galore, and she taught me how to make clothing for my dolls. One of the things she made which was a lifesaver, was a bag, a grocery bag that was about a foot high, maybe 6 inches deep. The miracle of this grocery bag was that it had false interiors. That is, from the outside, it looked like an ordinary canvas bag. If you looked inside very carefully, you could see that it had false sides and a false bottom. If you lifted the panels, you could see that there were spaces for a chicken, for a bottle of milk, for eggs, for all sorts of things that were illegal to obtain. My mother, who would take me along with her, would go to the farms about an hour's walk from where we lived, and we would obtain, as I mentioned, a chicken, dead of course, bottles of milk, eggs, all sorts of other products that were illegal to obtain in the regular market. She would close the flaps over them and then stuff the rest of the bag with ordinary vegetables, carrots, celery, potatoes, and then close the bag up, and we would march back home. That usually worked. Well, one day we had run such an escapade and we were on our walk back home. It was about an hour's walk and I was marching along with her, having a good old time. I was marching and singing numbers. I was singing 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, as if I was marching in a parade. And all of a sudden, roaring behind us, we heard a motorcycle, and we realized within minutes that it was a motorcycle with a sidecar with a German officer in the sidecar. My mother grabbed my hand and held it so tightly I thought she would break my hand. The motorcycle stopped next to us. My mother stopped. And the German officer tipped his cap to my mother, and with his baton, he motioned to her to come over to him and that he wanted to see what was in the bag. Well, my mother squeezed my hand so hard, I was sure she was breaking my fingers. My mother held the bag next to the officer. With his baton, he moved around the vegetables that he could see on top. He did not lift any of the panels, so he never saw any of the contraband food that was in the bag. My mother had stopped breathing. I could feel that in the way she held my hand, and I could hear her breath. There wasn't any. For that matter, I think I stopped breathing too. He moved his baton around in the bag, shook his head yes, looked up at her, tipped his officer's cap to her, and told his driver to move on. As he moved away, my mother began breathing, and she relaxed her hold on my hand. We slowly started to walk again. Neither of us said a word for the rest of the walk, which was about another 40 minutes till we got back to our home. It was an excruciating 40 minutes because both of us knew what had nearly happened and knew that the bag had worked in the sense that it had hidden what we needed to have hidden. My mother told my father the story, of course, and my father screamed about my mother taking me along on these walks. And my mother screamed back that if she hadn't had me along, she'd be dead. That having me along helped protect the whole mission. But in any case, I sure remembered all the details. To this day, and we're talking about 75 years ago, I remember every single detail. I could see it in my mind's eye. Every detail, as I tell it to you, I could see it all over again. It was part of the war experience. Now, what else can I tell you about? Yes, because of where we lived. I should ask for another slide. Can I have another slide, please? Remember I told you about being baptized? That's the church that I went to, Église Saint-Laurent. I used to go there for confession on Fridays. And that was hard for me because I was a very good girl. That was part of my job. And I had rarely something to confess. And I used to have conversations with the priests. We used to discuss what it was that I could confess. And he used to give me suggestions, such as, maybe, did you refuse to set the table for your mother? And I used to say, yeah, that was it. I refused to set the table. He said, okay, you can confess to that. And I would. And then he'd give me a prayer to say to make up for my refusal. In the distance, you could see the Virgin Mary. Can we have the next slide? My father had a very hard time with being alone and without having friends. We couldn't have friends. It was impossible. He settled his aloneness. He dealt with it by joining the church choir. And you can see him in the front row. He is the 1, 2, 3, 4. He's the fifth person from the right in the first row, with his arms crossed. Joining the church choir gave him something to do and gave him access to people. The priest is also in the front row. The priest knew about us and he became a friend. He used to come and visit us on Sundays. And I enjoyed his visits very much because even though I couldn't understand anything he talked about with my parents, I knew that he made them very happy. So I really enjoyed watching him come in on Sundays and converse with my parents. But anyway, my father really became a church choir member, and singing was his salvation. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, one of the elements of where we lived was that it provided my father with an escape route, which I knew all about because I had observed it. It was important for my father to be able to escape if he thought the Germans were on to him and he was about to be deported or taken to a concentration camp. His escape route was as follows. He would go out the left window onto the roof of the shed down below, which you can see the roof. You can see the roof behind that shrub. And he had a little ladder that he would use to get onto that roof. And then he would go over that roof onto the property next door, which was owned by a group of brothers, Catholic brothers, who ran a school. And they were part of the scheme, the escape scheme. They always had in their yard a hay wagon that was set up so that the hay had a hollowed out part underneath. And it was all set up so that my father could creep into the hollowed out part. And as soon as he came down and into the hay wagon, they would hitch it up to a horse. And one of the brothers would take the wagon out into the woods to a camp that they had where they could hide my father. So that was the escape route. I was familiar with it. For some reason, my parents had to trust me with the information. They were very careful about what they told me and what they didn't. And they didn't always explain to me why they told me things. I was very curious about everything, but I didn't really understand everything. So anyway, I was aware of that. Next slide, please. One day, there was a ring at the master door of the property. The property was surrounded by a massive stone wall with a gate at one point. And that was the gate. There was a ring at the gate and nobody was expected. So the owner of the property went to the gate, and he looked through a peephole that was directly over the mailbox, and he didn't see anybody. So he was very curious and very suspicious. The arrangement was that if he didn't see anything, he would turn and signal his wife, who was behind in their house, so that she could signal my father so he could begin his escape plan. Well, the doorbell rang again. The landlord was at his post near the mailbox, and he didn't see anybody. So he turned and he signaled his wife, who went to her kitchen and banged with a broom handle on the ceiling of her kitchen, which was a signal to my father, who went out the window and over the wall and was in the hay cart and was scooted off the premises to hide. The landlord then opened this massive door, and what did he find? But he found my little friend Michel saying, "J'ai oublié mon parapluie. I forgot my umbrella." My mother had relented and decided to let a friend come and play. He was the son of friends of my parents, and my mother relented. Michel came to play. He forgot his umbrella. Well, that was fine and good. One, I was never allowed a friend again. Two, my father was out in a hay wagon off someplace to go and hide in the woods, courtesy of the French underground, and he had to be recalled. So all of the energy was then spent on recovering my father wherever he was, getting him back to the house because it wasn't necessary to hide him. And that was the end of that episode. Next slide, please. Time marches on. My mother had educated me at home when I was very little. Eventually, I went to school. You can see me in the front row, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth from the right in the white sweater. We were allowed to go to school. We used a building that at some point the German soldiers were allowed to use, and then we were told we can't use it anymore because the German soldiers were very abused the building and left a lot of little animals behind. So we had to vacate the building, and they had to clean the building before children were allowed in. Anyway, that's just one picture of me in school. I wanted to play with some of the girls who were in that class, but my mother wouldn't allow it because my parents were both afraid to let anybody in our house to observe us, because they might figure out who we were and what we were, and that would reveal our existence, and that was too dangerous. Toward the end of the war, can we move on, please? Next slide. Oh, one thing I should mention, toward the beginning of the war, because this is very important. Very many Jewish families who thought they might get caught in some sort of net of Jews being picked up and sent to concentration camps or getting caught in some other way would sew money bills into the linings of their clothing. This was escape money, bribe money. It was money that they thought they could use to bribe their way out of a nasty situation. My mother went one better. When we arrived in Nepri, she took me with her, went to a local jeweler with bits of gold that she had saved from dental renovations, gold teeth that had been taken apart, a diamond that her grandfather had given her, bits of jewelry that had been taken apart. And she put all of that on the counter of the jeweler, and she drew a picture of this ring, and she said she wanted him to make it for her. He hemmed and he hawed. He said, it's very dangerous. How can he do that? The Germans come in and they order jewelry from him. How can he be seen to be making jewelry for somebody like us? But finally, she persuaded him to do it. And he arranged with his jewelers to make the ring for her. And a few days later, or I should say a couple of weeks later, we came back and he had the ring made for her. And it was this ring. For her, this was the escape ring. She put it on her finger. She didn't take it off for the rest of her life. During the war, it was the ring she counted on to use if we found ourselves in a drastic situation and we needed bribe money or a bribe ring to get out of a very drastic situation. If we found ourselves being about to be hauled off to a concentration camp or some equally awful situation, she would use that ring to bribe our way out. She put that ring on that day. It was end of October, 1942. And she didn't take it off for the rest of her life. I got it, and there she died. Very moving. Can you imagine that she made that design in 1942? My mother was a talented person. Not only was she a good doctor, my God, she made soap, she made clothing, she made pies, she made a ring. My mother, God bless her, was an incredible human being. She taught me how to knit clothing for my dolls. She also insisted during the war that I would be cold, so she made the most awful wool underwear that she insisted I wear, and it was terrible. It was itchy. It didn't keep me warm. It was uncomfortable, but she insisted that I wear it, so I wore it. My mother was a magnificent human being. Next slide, please. Okay, we're in America. It happened finally. Before we get to coming to America, I wanted to tell you about what it was like in the final days of Le Prix being liberated. Toward the end, when the war was finishing, Le Prix self-liberated, which is to say there were enough people who were fighting the end of the war in Le Prix that they fought the Germans right in Le Prix, and from the windows of the front of our apartment, as well as the landlord's apartment, we could watch the battle. And I remember from my window watching a building down the road a bit, a high-rise building, in which there were windows with partisans at the windows, and there were fighters in the garden in front of us, which was part of our property, and they were shooting at each other, and we couldn't tell who was who, except they were fighting with guns. It was amazing. We would watch the window in the high-rise open. Somebody would stand at the window and shoot at the person in the vegetable patch. The person in the vegetable patch would stand up, shoot at the person in the window in the building, and it would go on back and forth until either the person in the window would fall out or the person in the garden would fall down. And I mean, I was watching, it's like you might say today, cowboys and Indians, but it was an astonishing display of wartime. And we had front row seats. It was absolutely amazing. Now, the Germans had an encampment in Le Prix. They had by encampment, I mean, they had buildings at a distance from us, but some of which we could see from where we were living. And they were determined not to leave any of their records behind, whether they were bombed out or left. And they started blowing up their buildings. And I remember being at my window and watching literally walls explode into the air. It was absolutely amazing. And we were told that the Germans were blowing up their buildings so as not to leave any traces of what they had been up to during the war. It was amazing. I mean, I was a little girl and I was watching literally brick walls blowing up into the air. And I was told that that was the Germans blowing up their buildings. I can see it now. I remember it now. And I remember that in the street where we lived, a little bit further up toward the center of town, there were people who were being shot out of windows. We walked past and you were told, oh, Mrs. So-and-so fell out of a window last night here. Oh, what was she? Well, she was a collaborator. She worked with the Germans and somebody shot her and she fell out of a window. I mean, these were experiences that I was having, and it was left to my imagination what it must have been like to walk past the window and watch a body fall down on the street. It was utterly amazing. There were parades in Le Puy at the end because there were troops, international troops coming through. For example, American troops had landed in Italy and were coming up through Le Puy to link up with troops in the north of France. And my parents insisted that I come with them and sit on the sidewalk and watch the troops coming through. They wanted me to experience what it was like as Le Puy was being freed and as the war was ending. And it was utterly enthralling because the soldiers, especially the Americans, were throwing chocolate bars at the kids who were sitting on the sidewalks. And so, I was the happy recipient of chocolate bars. But I remember that the American chocolate bars were salty compared to the Italians' chocolate bars, which were sweeter. And apparently the Italian bars came from Switzerland, but the Americans were made in America and they were saltier. The memories that I have are absolutely ridiculous. Some of the parades included parading the women who had collaborated with German soldiers. And that was pretty horrific because those women were paraded through town and they were being punished. They had become the mistresses of the German soldiers and they were being paraded nude from the waist up with their arms behind their heads and as embarrassing as possible. And my parents wanted me to see all of that because it was part of the story of the end of the war. And I remember those images. It was pretty awful. In any case, that's part of the whole story. Eventually, we got to America. It was very, very difficult because American visas were difficult to get. They were based on very strict immigration laws in America. But we persevered and eventually we got here. My father came first. My mother and I came later. And I remember, and I was at that time still thinking I was Catholic from the time that we had been baptized. When my mother and I came over on the Queen Elizabeth, my father was already here and he was waiting with family down on the dock, and my mother and I were being processed in the on the deck of the Queen Elizabeth. We were being processed by immigration. At one point, my mother said to me, "Darling, there's something you should know. You don't really have to pray to little Jesus tonight anymore." And I said, "Oh, why is that?" Well, she said, "Well, we're not really Catholic, and we're going to be moving in with a family, relatives of ours who are Jewish. In fact, they're very, very Jewish. And she started to try to explain it all to me. And this was very, very confusing. And in fact, I was very distracted because being on the deck of the ship, I was more interested in watching the traffic on the West Side Highway, which was full of yellow cars. I had never seen yellow cars before. What I was seeing were taxi cabs. That was more interesting to me. But my mother was telling me about how I didn't have to pray to little Jesus anymore. All through the trip, I'd had a cross that I hung on the wall over my bed, and I prayed every night because I was, a good Catholic girl. And now she was telling me all of this stuff, and it was a lot of new information. But I took it all in, and eventually I understood about the yellow cars, and I found my father again, whom I hadn't seen in 6 months. And in this photo, you can see my mother, and you can see me. I'm the one with the pigtails, and the family that we moved in with, and the elderly gentleman next to me, who was very, very Orthodox Jew. He didn't speak any language except Yiddish and Hebrew, and I didn't speak any language except French, but we got along just splendidly. That worked just fine. And eventually, I learned enough English to be able to go to school. And here we are. I hope you have some questions for me. I hope some of the stories I told you are interesting. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Paulette, for sharing your really interesting and powerful story. I think we have a little less than 10 minutes for questions, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can type it in the chat box and I'm happy to read it out for you. Ava, do you have your hand up? Would you like to ask a question? Go ahead.
You got to take off your mask or bring it down.
My question is, when the war ended, would the people ever smile in those pictures again, like those paintings or photographs?
Ava, would you like to repeat your question loudly and clearly for Paulette so she can hear? Thank you.
When the war ended, would the people ever smile in the new pictures and photos and etc.?
Somebody's gonna have to repeat the question.
Sure. Ava, did you want to repeat it or would you like me to repeat it for you?
Repeat it for me, please.
Sure. So Ava asked, after the war, were people smiling in the pictures again?
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'll repeat it. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sure. So Ava wanted to know, after the war, were people smiling in photographs again? You showed us a lot of pictures, but did you feel like after the war, people were smiling once again?
Oh, sure. Yes, I mean, yes.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Oh, nice. I see that Natalie had their hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Were you able, where were you able to go to school during the war?
Was I able to go to sleep during the war?
War.
Yes.
Sorry, Paulette, were you able to go to school during the war?
Was I able to go to school? Yes. Yes, I went to school. When school was held, I was able to go to school.
Nyla, would you like to ask your question?
I went to school because I thought I was Catholic, and school was held and my mother sent me.
Thanks for clarifying, Paulette. Nyla, did you have your hand up?
How do you feel about sharing your story now?
How do I feel about sharing my stories? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes,
I
that's
love
the
it.
question.
How do I
Paulette, that
feel?
was the question. Yes.
I love it. I love what I'm doing now. I think it's very important for people like you to know what it was like. I think it's important to know the good stuff, the awful stuff, to get a feeling for what life was really like.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me ask you a question. How do you feel about having heard my stories? Don't pay me a compliment. Just tell me, what was it like to hear my stories?
It was shocking and surprising that that happened and people was like treating other people like that.
Did
Okay.
anyone else want to share or have a question? Let's see here. Nina, would you like to ask your question?
Did you know of any non-Jewish people who were taken and didn't survive?
Repeat the question. Did I know of any non-Jewish?
Non-Jewish people or rescuers who were taken and didn't survive?
Who were taken and didn't survive? No, I didn't personally know of any people like that. But there were plenty. There were.
And Paulette, you mentioned at the beginning that your parents were from Poland originally. Do you know what happened to your family members who were still there?
They died. They were killed. I do know. I have stories and records. In fact, what I often talk about is that at the beginning of the war, my parents went back to their cities and families to try to persuade them to leave. And their families would not leave. Their families felt safe. And that was a terrible mistake because their families were killed. Their families were completely killed. Their families should have left when they were warned, and they were destroyed. The people who stayed behind in Poland died. The ones who went west, family members who went to Paris, who went to Spain, who went to Vienna, mostly survived in one way or another. But the ones who stayed behind in Poland, who insisted that they would be safe, were not safe. They died. They were killed, and many in very, very atrocious ways. They were massacred. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, thank you, Paulette. Correct me if I'm saying your name wrong. Bergella, do you want to ask a question? Did I say your name right?
Well, it was close, right? Just speak.
Have you ever had a flashback of that specific year or day?
Could you repeat the question for Paulette, please? Thank you.
Have you ever had a flashback on that specific year or day?
Paulette, did you hear that?
No.
Okay. Have you ever had flashbacks from a specific day or an event from your experience?
Oh, yeah. I have those all the time. Yes. I will remember something very specifically. I'll give you a quick example. After we arrived in Le Prix, in a small city, I was very little. I was 4.5 years old. The first morning, I didn't know what to do with myself. My parents were unpacking. The owner of the property was in the process of turning a beautiful, large front lawn of flowers into a potato field. And he invited me and got my mother's permission to help him turn it into a potato field. So I went over and I was his helper. He would dig a hole and I would put a small potato bud into the hole, and I became his helper, planting a potato field. I felt very, very virtuous because I helped plant that field. And when the potatoes grew and we could eat potatoes, I felt proud that I had helped plant that potato field. But I remember that morning and working with him as he used a tool to dig a potato hole. And then when he had the hole made, I would put a bud into the hole, and I knew that a potato would grow there. That was very important to me. And that was the first morning that we lived in Le Prix. That was my job. And it comes back to me very vividly. Yes, it comes back to me.
Thank you, Paulette. Ms. Shannon, how many more questions can we take based on how much time you have?
I would say about 2.
Okay. Jaheem, would you like to ask your question?
Make sure you take your mask off.
Did you ever witness a family getting taken out of their house by the Germans?
Did I ever witness what?
A family getting taken out of their house by a German.
I'm sorry, I can't hear that.
Did you ever witness anyone being taken away by the soldiers?
No, I did not.
Let's see here. Justin, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Did you have rationed items?
Did I what others?
Did you have rationed items?
I'm sorry, did I what? I'm missing a word.
That's
He's
okay.
wondering if any of the items that you needed were rationed. Did you
Yes.
experience
Oh,
rationing?
sure. Oh, yeah. Food was rationed. Meat was rationed. You couldn't get meat. I didn't need them, but cigarettes were rationed.
Thank you, Paulette. Ms. Shannon, I know you wanted to take a photo with the group. Paulette, is it okay with you if the teacher takes a photo of everyone with you in it?
Sure.
Thanks.
Mr. Malaya, if you want to do that.
Hi, Paulette. Thank you for sharing your stories. I was here. I didn't want to, I wanted you guys to have your class, but they were fascinating. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a screenshot tool to take a photo of everyone. So what maybe we can do is I see most of us are wearing masks anyway, so this doesn't apply to you. But if you're not wearing a mask, feel free to smile big, just look at your camera, and you'll be fine. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you, everyone. And thanks again,
Thank you.
Paulette.
Thank you, all of you. I'm so glad you came, and I'm so glad you wanted to hear the stories.
Thank you so much that you are our living remembrance, and we appreciate your time. And we probably have a lot more questions, but we appreciate all that you did answer and to share your story with us. And just so you know, our students will continue to tell your story so that people remember.
Terrific, terrific. Thank you. It's important.
Thank
You so much.
If you have any other questions, you can email them to me, and I'm happy to get the answers from
Very
Paulette
good,
and
yes.
share them with you.
All
Happy
right,
to do
that would be awesome. Thank you very much.